The title of my presentation is Everything Old is New Again, because it does strike me, as a number of scholars have pointed out in the last several days, and indeed in the literature more broadly, that we do seem to be moving backwards on a number of fronts. Yet we are in the 21st century, so what do we do? I start on the point that the OECD has released some chilling data. Global inequality is at levels last recorded in 1820. Rises in global inequality from 1820 to 2000 were largely the product of widening gaps between countries. Yet since 2000, within-country inequality is the largest contributing factor to global inequality overall. These shocking statistics are linked to other disturbing global trends that many colleagues have already underscored, such as labor market expansion at the bottom end, stagnating wages in developed economies, and what Jamie Peck referred to yesterday as a hemorrhaging of union membership. Dramatic action is clearly required, but what is to be done? In 2010, Harry Arthurs asked a series of questions in his plenary address to CRIMT. Harry opened by asking whether anyone in the room seriously believed that our present system of labor and employment relations could ensure that working people have a decent standard of living, enjoy reasonable economic security, exercise a significant voice in the determination of their working conditions, and have access to a democratic process by which they can influence the public policies that affect them. The consensus was no. When Harry prompted us to consider whether we thought constitutional reform or electing social democratic governments would work either, we again said no. Yet we also said no when he asked us if we should just resign ourselves to a grim future. And as I have just outlined, the future does not appear to be what most of us would consider moving in a positive direction. In this address, Harry called upon us as scholars and as trade unionists and as social justice activists to fundamentally rethink what unions do, who they are for, how they work, and critically, if they work. It was at a conference called Union Futures. I'm here today to suggest that we need to look at history to see how we might move forward. If global inequality is now at pre-industrial revolution levels, we have a great deal of work to do. We need to give 21st century content to 19th century conditions. The good news is we might have templates for how to do it. One option is to look at unions who have a long history of representing the most precarious of workforces, whereby work is organized around insecure, unpredictable freelance contracts that can last as short as one day, and where an 8-month-long gig is considered a long-term, lucrative engagement, where high skills and high wages do not necessarily translate into high incomes, where labor markets are deeply bifurcated with enormous income discrepancies between the top and bottom ends, where workforces are pushed and pulled around the globe, or conversely, firmly rooted in place, as a consequence of citizenship and policy regimes designed almost exclusively in the interests of romancing capital, what Phil just referred to as foreign direct investment, with little to no consideration of the social impact of these developments. And indeed, where workers have limited, vague, unpredictable access to social benefits as a consequence of their status as self-employed micro-enterprises or as a consequence of their unstable relationship to paid employment. Does this sound familiar? I could be talking about the garment trade, the retail sector, health services, the building trades, agricultural workers, or indeed, and increasingly, higher education. But I am talking about the film and television production industry. I turn to unions in the film and TV production industry because labor markets and working conditions in film and TV, and indeed the arts more broadly, are historically and prototypical of the kinds of sweeping changes we have seen in the world of work and employment relations in the last 30 years. Furthermore, in sharp contrast to many industries in the private sector in the 21st century, the film and television industry in North America has a high union density rate, particularly in scripted film and television, which is the most watched form of entertainment. Furthermore, there is evidence that union memberships are growing. Why? Is it the labor and employment relations framework? Certainly not. The labor relations regime has an uncertain and certainly uneven relationship with the film and TV sector, as the unions represent freelance independent contractors, many of whom are in management positions. I will leave it to the finely tuned legal minds in the room, and indeed the union reps from the film and television industry that have joined us today, to engage in the finer points of this issue. But the takeaway is that it is not a highly institutionalized collective bargaining regime that gives the unions their strength. A substantial aspect of union strength in the film and television production sector is the fact that a union card is seen as evidence of professional skill and expertise in a long-standing craft tradition. It is also deeply tied to the ways in which the unions service their members. The key argument that I will advance today is that policy advocacy is a key aspect of the ways in which unions in the film and TV industry service their members and play a broader role not just in shaping workforces or workplaces, but in shaping labor markets. Film and TV unions, in short, have four aspects that make them distinct. One, basically, the contract follows the worker, not the workplace. Two, the union services the worker outside of the workplace. Unions provide a range of valuable benefits and services to their members in the absence of a stable employer, including health and dental insurance, retirement funds, skills development and training, life insurance, disability insurance, and societies that collect and distribute intellectual property rights income. ACTRA, the performers union, has gone so far as to create a credit union to meet the extremely challenging financial needs of their members and indeed workers in the arts and cultural industries more broadly. These services are in addition to provide to the other more traditional aspects that unions play in terms of providing work opportunities to their members by functioning as hiring halls to various degrees, organizing new sectors and workplaces, collective bargaining, and workplace representation. Point three, the unions have proven themselves to be agile adapters in representing workforces while maintaining and expanding union jurisdiction in rapidly changing labor market conditions. Technological convergence, cross-platform distribution, and technological innovation, such as the advent of the digital camera. When we say we work in film, almost no one works in film anymore. The Cinematographers Guild has just taken out of their training manual how to load a camera mag in celluloid film. Anyway, all of these have radically impacted the organization of work, workflows, the geographical distribution of work, and the skill sets required to ensure that local labor markets maintain their competitive edge in a highly globally competitive industry. In the absence of a regular employer, these unions play the role of training, accrediting, and marketing their labor markets on a global scale. The union plays an active role, finally, not just in responding to labor market conditions, but shaping them. Film and TV markets, production markets, are shaped by a huge range of factors, including currency exchange rates, investment strategies by major global media enterprises, and importantly, a range of public policy initiatives that extend well beyond the traditional labor and employment relations framework. And it is this public policy work that unions do that will be the primary focus of the rest of our talk today. So today I will offer to you a contentious proposition that the battles that unions are fighting or need to be fighting are not necessarily based in the workplace any longer. I am not the only one to make this argument. Again, as Harry argued in 2010, collective bargaining outcomes are essentially determined not by labor and management at the bargaining table, but elsewhere. The policy domains in which film and television unions are involved include international trade agreements, intellectual property rights, broadcasting regulation, national and state or provincial tax credit regimes, intra- and international labor mobility, immigration, and access to social services, such as income tax averaging and employment insurance for the cultural workforce. Thus, we can see that film and television unions engage in a wide range of policy issues that travel horizontally across policy portfolios and vertically through layers of the state. The policy portfolio for unions is complex because, and again, as Harry noted, the complexity of the ways in which public policy choices shape labor markets and working conditions. But it's important to understand that not only does public policy shape labor markets, but unions themselves. Yesterday, Jamie Peck delivered an excellent, if not again chilling analysis of the sharp rise in right-to-work legislation in the United States, noting that the right to work is seen as central to economic development policy strategies. Some of you may have heard of the creative economy, which is also a rather popular economic development strategy in a post-industrial world, and one that has given the film and television sector a considerable boost over the last 15 years. A policy anchor for local creative economy strategies is the film and television tax credit regime. Tax credits are designed to draw footloose capital into local labor markets in which the skill and expertise of the crew is promoted as the key industry infrastructure in a labor-intensive industry. An unintended consequence of the tax credits has not only been to boost local labor markets, but also union memberships. For example, IATSE Studio Mechanics Local 479 in Atlanta had 191 members in 2001. After the state decided they would like to be a creative economy, they rolled out a tax credit program in 2008, and the membership doubled. In 2014, IATSE Local 479 reported that membership is hovering about 1,800 members, with 30 to 40 new members applying to join every month. The explosion in union membership is all the more astonishing given that Georgia is a right-to-work state. As I have written elsewhere, while the tax credits can boost local labor markets, they can also restrict collective bargaining power through fierce regional competition and restrict worker mobility due to state or provincial residency requirements for the worker whose labor is the object of the policy program. Consequently, unions are deeply involved in the tax credit file, and there are legion examples of this, but I will focus on one today. And we will look at the Atlantic region because it's interesting insofar as it's a multi-provincial region, yet and has a number of small labor markets within it. And unions have come up with some really interesting ways of trying to deal with some of these problems. In 2010, the film and television unions representing the workforce in the Atlantic region of Canada approached the Nova Scotia government with a proposal to address intra-regional competition and restricted worker mobility within the Atlantic provinces. The idea was to develop a deeper labor pool that services the Halifax Production Centre of Atlantic Canada, while discouraging the practice of importing workers from outside the Atlantic region or indeed outside the country. Unions proposed reciprocity for the tax credit programs with other Atlantic provinces so as to facilitate the movement of experienced Nova Scotians within the region, providing Nova Scotia workers with greater access to work opportunities and allowing them to maintain their ties to the industry over the long term. The proposal was basically this: Nova Scotia residents would qualify for the full tax credit, Workers from other Atlantic provinces who were brought in for the project would be eligible for a discounted tax credit, and workers outside the region would remain ineligible overall. This is a very short version of a very long and complicated process that the unions went through. These unions, though, it's important to note they have limited staff resources, and they are charged, the Directors Guild of Canada has 1.5 staff members in it in the Atlantic region, and they represent workers across 5 provinces. Developing policy capacity requires a long-term commitment from unions and substantial dedicated resources. It's an investment in the union's future and those of its members. It requires an outward-facing approach to the political and economic environment in which the unions operate, and the ability to make sense of that and communicate it to the memberships whose livelihoods are deeply tied to it. So in short, policy advocacy requires considerable time and expertise for the unions. Yet we know that time and expertise and resources are often in short supply in the union world. And to make matters worse, policy advocacy is also a very messy and unpredictable business. Where's my photo? I'm clearly not a film and television technician. So there's a big photo of all of the film and TV workers protesting a policy announcement that was just released in the Nova Scotian budget. So not only were the unions unsuccessful in their policy offer to government, but the industry overall was recently dealt a blow when the newly elected Liberal government effectively dismantled the provincial tax credits in the May 2015 budget, calling the future of the entire sector into question. In response to an industrial crisis which is rooted in a public policy decision in the Department of Finance, the unions were quickly able to mobilize their memberships and political protest. They were all film technicians. They were all dressed in black, and it was nighttime, so it was hard to see them. As labor market institutions, unions have the capacity to represent the interests of their members in the policy processes. By engaging in advocacy work, unions are able to demonstrate a broadly based and in many cases proactive approach to labor market development. This underscores the value of the union to the members and deepens the relationship between the unions and the membership. This is particularly important when the workplace is not necessarily a space where communities are built. In the film and TV industry, you might have 20 or 30 workplaces in a year. So in this sense, the union becomes a community in its own right. The union is able to draw upon the high degree of member engagement and deep links with the community in moments where mobilization is required to underscore and buttress their policy work, and they use that deep relationship with the community to inform their policy activities. I'm nearly done. Yet to return to Harry's call to arms 5 years ago, we need to try something different. So developing an advanced policy capacity for unions under contemporary capitalism must be seen as central to union purpose. It may in fact require a reorganization of the unions themselves in terms of the relationship and or ability of support between local and national offices, and the ability for unions to act horizontally across portfolios and vertically through layers of the state. The future of unions begins in its relationship with its members. Traditionally, in many sectors, the union serves the member in the workplace, and indeed, this is still important. Yet if those members are increasingly detached from stable workplaces, we need to rethink how those relationships are formed. I would argue that this requires servicing members in different ways, and one of those ways is indeed at the policy level. Now, this can pose fundamental challenges to unions, particularly as social movements, insofar as having policy capacity requires working across all political parties and working within the government that you're given. And I will also underscore that unions need to distinguish the difference between politics and policy. Some of the most policy-involved unions in the arts have deep and long-standing relationships with social democratic governments, yet this has not precluded these same unions from making substantial gains in other jurisdictions with liberal and conservative governments. Indeed, returning to that case study from Georgia, the right-to-work state, the president of the article commented in an article in Fortune magazine that the union has a surprisingly strong relationship with the Republican state legislature and calls GOP Congressman Rick Stevens one of the union's biggest fans. So let's return very quickly to the principles that I'm advancing here in an attempt to consider how we might give 21st century content to 19th century conditions. One, the relationship between the worker and the union is the most important relationship that there is. Workplaces change, but attachment to a union can be enduring. So unions must fundamentally rethink why workers not only join, but stay. This means rethinking where and when unions organize and represent their workforces. And secondly, echoing many other arguments made already today, the union must understand that the worker is a citizen, and that citizenship, industrial citizenship, social citizenship, is deeply tied to the decisions that governments make. Thus, we require a body of scholarship and a union movement that rethinks and expands what unions do and why.